Greetings in the Triune Deity, whose we are and whom we serve. What a wonderful opportunity it is again to be with you right here in Hope 103.1 FM for another edition of IPA Threshing Helpline. And we are delighted to be joining with you in your homes, in your cars, wherever you are at this hour. We want you to tune in to our Facebook page, International Pentecostal Assembly Grenada, and you can join us here live on stream with the Facebook page. And we also want you to share the link with a friend so that they can tap into this good stuff that's happening here on Hope 103.1 FM. The threshing flow is in the house. We shout out to all of our IPA family across the island and, of course, Grenada. We are happy to be joining with you today. And we have a very important and striving discussion for you this evening as we welcome our guest with us, a very, very important man in our nation. I have known him in the legal profession for all I can remember. And so he's going to be joining with us. He's no stranger to the media or to the Grenada uh, audience. And so his name is Mr. Tyrone Buckmeyer. And of course, he represents Legal Aid Counseling Clinic. And the newest initiative is the Spotlight Initiative. And we are going to be discussing here this evening sexual abuse and offenses, really, and sexual crimes as we delve into our IPA hotline. As we say in IPA, you need to hear this. And so we want you to invite someone to join in. Mr. Tyrone, welcome to the program. Welcome to our IPA Threshing Helpline. We are delighted to have you today.
Thank you very much, Bishop Esther. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to all the members of your audience. I'm happy to be able to join you today for the conversation, and I hope we'll be able to bring some information and enlightenment to persons who may have questions around the issues we've discussed today.
Yes, of course, and we know you're going to give us all the enlightenment. A rich resource you are indeed.
Thank you. I just want to make the correction that you mentioned in the introduction in the legal profession. I am not, in fact, legally trained. I'm not a lawyer. But as the head of Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic, we do have a legal department. We have a lawyer and paralegals on our team at Legal Aid. And I have been in and around the profession for a very long time. I spend a good amount of my time in court, but not as a lawyer, really as an advocate.
Great. And we thank you for qualifying that. And of course, that is the context in which I spoke. But we are going to delve into, the meat of the matter, give the people some information that will help thresh the anxieties, that will help us with our mental resolve. And we know in recent times we have had many discussions of a growing trend that we've seen in our nation. And of course, it's not new. And this issue is not new. This is an issue that is global, really. But we've seen a rising trend in our local constraint. And we want to talk about it today. We want to talk about sexual offenses and sexual crimes. And so, Mr. Tyrone, we want you to help us to understand what is sexual crimes, what is a sexual offense, and what are some of the sexual offenses that are qualified under that.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, to echo your sentiment that this issue of sexual crime and sexual violence in Grenada is not at all new. Unfortunately, we have had, as far as I know, we've always had incidences of sexual crimes of one type or the other, going back to my childhood. It is in fact one of the reasons that I personally got involved in the field of work that I am in, and I've been in this field of work for 33 years. So literally right out of secondary school, some 33 years ago after I graduated from secondary school, I started to work in this field because I realized then that there were a lot of young people, and I came to this knowledge and realization while I was at secondary school, where a number of my classmates, and this is in the 1980s and 19 in the 1980s, in fact, a number of my classmates, just in classroom and schoolyard conversation, will confess or admit or just disclose, that they were being touched, or certain things were being done to them. And in most cases back then, it was by family members. And we probably didn't understand it in the context of being sexual offenses that were punishable by law and so forth. But these were young people, and I went to an all boys school. So these were young men who were speaking about things that were happening to them, as I said, largely within the context of their families, by other members of their families, and in some cases in their communities. What has happened that has made a difference and that has made it much more of a public issue now, that we see and hear so much of it, and it is so prevalent in the media, I think is a result of the work that we have done as Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic, alongside many other agencies over the last 30 years or so, to raise public awareness, to bring very clear focus on the fact that sexual offenses are a crime, they're punishable by law. We've actually made, as Grenada in 2012, we changed we updated the sexual offenses legislation. I will speak more about this later. So sexual offenses really include a whole host of actions that can be taken against the person, um, especially without consent, um, where one person, either a male or female offender, chooses to use his or her position of authority or power or control over another person and subjects that person to unwanted sexual actions. Now, these sexual actions include everything from touching, fondling, caressing, and so on. It could also include what is called penetrative sex. That's when it becomes rape as an offense. But there are a whole host of different actions that are recognized under Grenada sexual offenses legislation. And as I said, in 2012, the country took a bold step of updating the legislation, which included doing away with some of the names of some of the offenses, reclassifying some of the offenses so that they're more inclusive to recognize both offenses against young males and young females equally. And then we also increased the penalties for some of the offenses.
Great, great, and that is an expanded analysis there of sexual offenses. But would you pinpoint some of the penetrative sexual offenses, or
Okay.
even like you said, rape is one of them? Maybe you
Yeah.
want to highlight some others.
Right. So there are some different classifications that are based on age and so forth. Now, up to 2012, there was an offense on the books that was called defilement of a female. And this would have happened when somebody would have had intercourse with a female child. So to defile means to take the maidenhead, so to speak. So that offense was on our books up to 2012. It is a sexual offense because it spoke to having penetrative sexual intercourse with a child, a female child. In 2012, during the review, that offense was changed. So we no longer have it as defilement of a female because it was recognized by the very name of the offense that it really spoke to it only happening to a young female child. Okay? But we recognize, because we've had a long history of this, unfortunately, that a lot of our young male children are also the victims of sexual offenses. So now, for example, if one were to go to a courthouse on any given day of the week when the court is in session, and you look at the cause list that is placed outside of the court that lists the offenses for which people are being charged, you may see an offense that is sexual intercourse with a person under the age of 13. And then you might see just before, or above or below that, you may see another offense, which is sexual intercourse with a person over the age of 30, but under the age of 16. As people would probably know, or if for the information of all your listeners, the age of sexual consent in Grenada is 16. And what that means very clearly is that no person under the age of 16, male or female, can give consent to sexual intercourse or to sexual activity. So any person, male or female, who commits a sexual act, whether it is penetrative or non-penetrative, against a Grenadian person under the age of 16 years old is committing a crime and can be punished. Now, that's very interesting, Bishop, because when you look at the amount of teenage pregnancy we've had over the last couple of decades, you wonder why half of the Grenadian male population is not in jail. Because every year we have a lot of teenagers under the age of 16 giving birth. And it means that whoever impregnated that child should be charged because under the age of 16, the child cannot give consent. All right. Um, so that was one of the changes that was made, as I said, went from defilement of a female to sexual intercourse with a person under the age of 13 or over the age of 13, but under the age of 16. And in the same legislation change in 2012, we removed a defense that was called the honest belief defense. Prior to and up to 2012, a defendant could go to court and say and use as a defense, I thought the person, based on the looks or the size of the person's body, any number of things, I honestly believe that this person was over the age of consent and therefore I cannot be held responsible for my actions. We removed that from the books in 2012. So there's no such defense anymore. The person who, the adult or the older person has a responsibility to ensure that the child is not, or the person has passed the age of consent. Any interaction, sexual interaction, or any interaction of a sexual nature with that person under the age of 16 constitute an offense. Another significant thing that happened in 2012 is that we removed the statute of limitation on the reporting and prosecuting of sexual offenses. Prior to that time, I think it was a really short period of time. I wouldn't give you I cannot give you at this point off the top of my head the exact period, but it was a very short period. So sometimes you had a matter where somebody committed a sexual offense against a child, and literally before you turn around, as we say locally, the statute had expired, so a case could not be brought anymore. That is no longer the case. A criminal case can actually be brought against an offender years after the actual incident happened because we no longer have a statute of limitation. So you have rape, you have sex with a minor or sex with a person under the age of 13, sex with a person above the age of 13, but under the age of 16. And then you have some other offenses, indecent assault, which is a sexual offense that is related to touching, fondling, etc., but not penetration.
Great, great. And it's interesting that you mentioned the laws relative to the timing of an offense because we've had in our situation offenses that have happened for years ago, but it has created tremendous impact in a negative way. And so
Yes,
justice have not been able to be served because the case is kind of thrown out because of
yeah,
the longevity of time. And so
yeah,
it's very interesting that that kind of revision has been done so that,
yes,
perpetrators can be held accountable because we have a lot
yes,
of
yeah.
cases where that is the reality.
Yeah, and they need to know that we'll come for you. It might be 10 years later, but you'll be found, you'll be caught. Because you see, it was a thing of great frustration for us in the field because sometimes we were actively working on a matter, but then the 3 months or whatever it was expired. So even if you had all the facts in hand, you could no longer ask for a case to be brought because the statute had passed. So that was a victory.
Yeah.
And I think all the updates that were done in 2012 represent a victory for the system in terms of Grenada's ability and seriousness as a country to address sexual offenses, especially against our children.
Right, right. And if we could just move a little bit from just the children, and we're coming back to that,
Mhm.
but we have things like, texting and those kinds of, pornography. And in Grenada, we talk a lot about sodomy, as what the
Yeah,
law really pounds down on in Grenada. Tell us more about those, because I think the reality is that we do not know what constitute the sexual offenses. And
right. Yeah.
so, because people are not aware, you see men, they just behave in certain ways, or people behave in certain ways generally, and it becomes sexual offenses, and we don't know their offenses. So, we want to qualify. Those are the things that people could stay clear of, because they're treading on dangerous grounds when they begin to do things like that.
Okay. Well, I want to say two things in relation to this. The first is that the offenses you usually hear of most, obviously, will be offenses that are committed against children. Um, so I spoke more to those, but we also have a lot of intimate partner sexual violence, and that what that means are intimate partners will be, for the most part, or should be, adults who are in a consenting relationship, but where sexual violence is used by one or the other partner against, one partner against the other, right? So you have sexual violence in that context of intimate partner relationships. And a lot of these are also treated with in the court, but often they're dealt with as a part of a broader domestic violence charge and so forth. And then what you spoke to on the books in Grenada, we still have a law that speaks about sodomy, which refers to sexual intercourse between two males. Um, there are moves in some countries in the region. Some have already gone in that direction. Others are in the looking at changing the legislation to take this off the books as an offense, because of course we recognize people's right to sexual choice, so that persons can choose to be in the relationship of their choice, but of course that will be guided by a whole host of factors that they must consider on an individual and on a level as a couple, if they're looking to become a couple. And of course the conversation comes up in the religious context in terms of what is morally right, what is allowed, what does the Bible condone and does not condone. But we do have on the law books in Grenada today still, sodomy is a sexual offense, and that speaks to both um, what you will call homosexual relationships or heterosexual relationships. So I think if anybody bothered, and I stand corrected, if there's a legal mind listening to this and wants to correct me, I stand corrected. But I think if somebody bothered, they could bring a case against a husband and wife who practice a certain type of sexual behavior within the confines of their home. But in the context of human rights and people's rights to choose, you have this debate about, does the state, in terms of the law, have a place in the bedroom? Should couples be free to make their own decisions about their preferred sexual practices as consenting adults? That is a broader debate. As rights advocate, we at Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic recognize and respect persons' rights to individual choice. So these are not matters that we give opinions on or that we give advice on. We respect people's right to personal choice once they have looked at all the factors involved and they decide to go in a particular direction. But it is useful for the listening audience to know that on our law books at the moment, sodomy is a crime.
Right. That's very interesting, because many people, we have a lot of open practices in terms of homosexuality. In Grenada, it has become a kind of, before, it was a taboo, it was an, behind the curtains kind of thing, but
Yeah.
now it's plain and out there in the
It's
public.
much more visible now. Yeah,
Yes, it's
much more
important,
visible.
because we talk about discrimination, and you have that kind of debate going on that side of it. I mean, it's a global issue, but in
Yes.
terms of our local context,
Mhm.
how that plays out and how we give leverage to that kind of behavior is very critical.
Yeah, I agree. And again, same-sex relationships refers to both male on male same-sex relationships, which sometimes are more commonly referred to as gay or homosexual relationships. And then there are female on female, same-sex female couples
Right.
that are considered that are called lesbian relationships. So as I said, as rights advocates, we respect people's right to choice, but it is important that people know that the law may take a
Right.
different view of behavior that they have decided to normalize or to accept as part of their way of life.
Great, great. And so let's talk about sexual crime, in terms of how the law deals with sexual offenses and sexual crimes and the punishment that is meted out. We know we have some situations, that is very, debatable. But so we're going to talk about that in a while, folks. If you're just joining with us here, we are at the IPA Threshing Flow Helpline, and with us this evening is Mr. Tyrone Buckmeyer, and he's going to be sharing with us in terms of sexual crimes and sexual offenses that we can educate ourselves about and live as a society with regard to each other. So we want you to share the link. You can visit our Facebook page, International Pentecostal Assembly, Grenada, and you can join us there with the discussion. You can send in your question. In fact, later on, we're going to have you call in. The number to call is 403. And of course, Hope is 103.1. So we just say 1031. So that's the easy way to remember it. 403. 1031 is the number to call. But we'll have your calls later on. But we're going back to Mr. Tyrone because we want to milk him today. And so to get all the information that we can relative to this growing issue in our country and in how we can alleviate and how we can better deal with issues like that. So we go into sexual crimes and how they're treated. And of course, Mr. Tyrone, we know in Grenada that we have had many issues where relative to sexual crimes. In fact, most people say, things are not fair on the legal side because the perpetrators, they seem to spend a little time in there and then come back out and mingle again in the society, again waiting for their next victim. Talk to us about that kind of situation.
Yes, it's a troubling situation in the sense that while I am proud of the sort of legislation we have on the books, the kind of punishments we have, we do not often see the full force of the law, so to speak, exercised. So you would see an offense where, based on the law, the offender, once convicted, can be given a sentence of 15 years for each offense, for each conviction. But the judicial officer, that is a judge in most cases, because sexual offense matters are usually held at the high court level. The judge in the case might decide to, while in, discretion could allow for 15 years for one conviction, might choose to give the offender 5. And these sexual offenses, by their very nature, they evoke a lot of passion on the part of the public. So when people see um, a big hardback man, so to speak, in Grenadian parlance, rapes a child, and the judge could give the man 15 years, but chooses to give the man 5 years, people get very passionate, very emotional, very angry about that, right? We who serve the court, either in terms of providing information, doing social inquiries, and so on, ought not to publicly comment on the actions that the judicial officers take. But sometimes we too are really quite moved by or affected by how small the punishment can be. Because unfortunately, in a smaller society as Grenada, when somebody commits a sexual offense and is charged, convicted, and imprisoned, if they have a relatively short sentence, well, whatever is the length of the sentence, in almost every case, that person will eventually be released. And sometimes, even when the court goes for a higher sentence in terms of what is allowed, the person will still be released at some point. And sometimes they get released early because of good behavior and other considerations that are taken at the level of the prison system. So people can are often very disappointed because they don't feel the punishment was severe enough given the crime, especially when the crime is committed against a child. I mean, I know of way too many cases where children were raped, violated, and the offenders got 5 years, 7 years, and before you blink, almost that time is up already. And then that person returns to our society, and in many cases, we don't do well. Prior to a few years ago, we didn't do a lot of rehabilitation. So some of these persons went into prison, spent a few years, came out without any shift in their behavior, and look for opportunities to take a, to prey on victims again. So this is the kind of thing that gets people passionate. So you hear a lot of comments when a sentence is handed down. But we must understand that the judges or the judicial officers, they will make a decision based on the facts before them. And those facts, the evidence, the information before them, the level of argument or representation the offender has, a lot of things play into a decision. And we can get passionate and we have the right to express our passion. But unfortunately, if we're not sitting on the bench, we are not the ones who get to hand down the sentence, you know? So I feel that, when court cases go to court, clearly we would like those of us who work in the system as victims' rights advocates, we would hope that the offenders will get the fullest extent, the heaviest hammer that the law could give. But those are not decisions that we can make. So we have to go with what the court eventually decides.
Right. And we do agree that these kinds of offenses, they create tremendous long-term impact on the victim. I mean,
Yeah,
we come into the perpetrators because they too have their long-term effect, but a lot of people are not sympathetic to the perpetrators. They're more sympathetic to a child,
yeah,
some young girl who has lost her uterus or ability to give birth again, or some child who have been damaged badly, not
yeah,
just physically but emotionally and otherwise. And
yeah,
so those are the kinds of vexing situations that causes this, as you said, people to become passionate
yeah.
about how the offenders are treated. And Brother Tyrone, if you look back at last year, for example, in COVID time, right, when we had the situation of the lockdown, and many of these perpetrators are within the same environment,
Oh, yes.
right, or the same yard space, the same house, that an innocent child, a victim, are there. And so we have those kinds of, and in Grenada, in a lot of cases people don't talk out, children abused in silence. And so we want to talk about that kind of situation. And I understand that there is a registry that's being looked at and developed in terms of how these perpetrators, and you say some of them come out because of good behavior, they're on bail, and they go back into the same environment where they've committed their crimes. And
Yeah.
so, how does the system change that trajectory or that situation, that narrative?
Um, I would admit to you, Bishop, that one of the things that worried us most as legal aid and counseling clinic going into the lockdown situation last March 2020 was this fear that a lot more children were vulnerable. Because, as you rightly say, in so many cases in this country, the offenders are living in the same household as the victim, whether they're fathers, grandfathers, uncles, cousins, step parents. Is a whole host of people that can be offenders. And in many, many cases, we had the reality where here we were going to be stuck in a situation where you can't get out of the house the next morning and run to town or to legal aid or to the special victims unit, to the police, to child protection authority to make a report. And because we had some other things that came out of the COVID situation, for example, the need to do online school where In some households, the person with the phone or the device might have been the man who the child now has to go and beg and ask for a favor to be allowed to use the tablet. You have households where the children may not have had access to electricity to charge their devices, so they had to go up the road or down the road or across the road or into the other yard to get a charge. All of these things made them much more vulnerable. Personally, I still feel a little discomfort, a little worried about what would have happened in that period. I haven't seen any statistics yet to suggest that there was a significant increase in the incidence of sexual offenses, both against children and against women in intimate partner relationship situations. I have not had access to any data that suggests that there was a great increase, but my gut instinct is just by virtue of how these incidents occur, I suspect there were more in 2020 than we have seen. This is not qualified by any data. I have said this more than once. I haven't seen any data to suggest. But when you think of the reality that even in good times, in non-COVID times, so many children fell victim in their own homes and in their own villages. Um, I think it stands to reason that there's a good possibility that there was an increase. And I hope the statistics, when they're eventually released by the competent authority, will not bear me out, but I suspect they may, because we have seen the patterns, of how the abuse happens. And one of the realities of the abuse is that the children who are abused are threatened and coerced into remaining silent. And sometimes with simple promises of treats, KFC, a top up, an ice cream, and sometimes it goes from simple coercion to the very sinister reality where children are threatened that if they tell the man who is the mother's boyfriend and technically the breadwinner for the family says, if you tell your mother, I wouldn't come back here, who go pay the phone bill, who go pay light bill, how you don't get money to go to school, who go buy your uniform, who go buy food. And the children feel, well, I have the responsibility of the welfare of my family on my shoulders, so I can't tell anybody because I don't want my family to suffer. So sometimes the threats are so sinister that children who, even those that are a little braver and under ordinary circumstances might be tempted to talk, wouldn't talk because they're made to feel this burden that they're protecting their family's welfare by not complaining. So it's a very sinister reality in which sexual offenses happen. And I support the idea of a sexual offenses registry. We've been calling for this for years. This is not a new thing for us, especially in the non governmental sector that works in this area. We've been asking for a sexual offenders registry for years. The government got hot on the idea for a few days, then they went very cold on the idea. Then a child was murdered, and everybody started again. We wanted it, and then they went cold on it again. And now I see there we've had consultations up till actually 2 weeks ago, I think. We had a national consultation around this issue of having a sexual offenders registry. We absolutely support that because we feel that persons who rape and take advantage of children need to be named, shamed, publicly identified, so that they think twice before they commit these offenses. You will have, of course, the hardcore offender who you literally could have his name in blinking lights on a billboard and he will still rape a child if he gets the opportunity. So those are the hardcore ones. But I think there is a place for the registry because A, it gives us a national database of who these persons are. B, a registry, if operated in the way that they traditionally are, will track these persons as they move through so the shame will go with them. So if somebody is a sexual offender, was a sexual offender in River Road, and then was imprisoned or charged, came out of River Road and decided to move to Snell Hall or anywhere else, in the receiving village will get the information. The police station in that village will know that there is a registered sex offender moving here or a registered sex offender has moved here. The social work fraternity, the agencies that provide support for victims will know that this person is around. That will be one way I think of keeping the public eye very well focused on the perpetrators to the extent where they will definitely think twice before they act. So legal aid is very much on board with the idea of having a sex offenders registry for Grenada, but we cannot fool ourselves as a country into believing that a sexual offenses registry in and of itself is going to do all the work that we need done. We have a lot more work to do. And part of the work must be this kind of conversation where actively, we're constantly actively putting information about their body sexual offenses. Because the reality is the biggest protector of children in the society will be the society, right? Will be people who are concerned, who are in communities, who have the ability because they live there and they know when a strange person is around, or they know the behaviors of a child because they observe that child on the road every day, and suddenly that behavior changes. Members of the public will be able to say, wait a minute, this child is no longer her bubbly self or his rambunctious self. You need to find out what's going on. The biggest, so I think the biggest protector of children could be the society. But right now, one of the biggest facilitators of sexual offenses is the society because we're hypocrite to a large extent. We know it's happening and we don't want to talk about it. We know it's happening, but we want to protect because the offender might be our brothers and cousins and people we know. So we want to protect them. And so we don't talk. And sometimes when a report is made, in our hypocrisy, sometimes we even deny the report on behalf of the offender and they get away and continue to do it over and over again.
Yeah, Mr. Tyrone, you made a very, very important point. While the registry is a good tool, it is not an end in itself.
Exactly.
But so, we talk about society being that great tool in identifying. But so help us to understand, how do we spot out, how do we identify a perpetrator? Because sometimes they're our own families.
Yeah.
They're a child's daddy, a stepdaddy.
Yeah.
Not just in the male side, we don't want to be biased here, but we have
Yeah.
female
They are female
and
perpetrators.
teachers, they pry on, the students and so forth like that. So people, trusted people that you're investing your children and trusting your children to as custodians, they are the ones that are hurting them. So
Yeah.
how can a child, an innocent child, or a child who have trusted a parent or a guardian, can spot out a perpetrator? I mean, it might not be as a walk in the park, but tell us from your own experience how we can identify somebody who might be, become a victim. Because we know many people use the economic circumstances, they use things that allow, vulnerability, and they pry on that vulnerability. So help us to understand so that those that are viewing out there, parents who might want to say, you know what, I want to go down the street, I want to go on a vacation. Can I feel comfortable to leave my daughter, my son in the care of this individual?
Right. Well, Bishop, this I'm scratching my head because this is probably the hardest question you would ask me today. Well, there may be harder ones, but this is a really hard one because the reality is that the offenders look like us. They look like normal, regular, everyday people.
Sure.
And sometimes the offenders make a particular effort to look like responsible, respectable people. So it's really hard to spot a perpetrator on sort of an outside appearance thing. What we need to teach children is rather than look for physical signs in terms of the person might look a particular way, act a particular way, talk a particular way, we need to teach children to be aware of certain danger signals in behavior and tone of voice. So we have to teach children about bad touch. We have to teach children about being wary when somebody is making too much of an effort to get close to you or to entice you away from a group of friends and to encourage you to go somewhere that is a little more private and is too eager to touch your knee. And then if you don't box away the hand or you don't express discomfort, the hand moves from the knee and goes up a little higher, then a little higher, and then a little higher. Because in truth, we have perpetrators in the churches in positions of authority, in schools in position of authority, in the police services in positions of authority, in the community in positions of authority. So it's not hard to spot them. Here is part of the reality, though. A lot of us know who they are in the villages. In my experience, as I've worked this in this field for so many years, in a lot of cases, the perpetrators are persons of influence in our community, the shopkeeper, you know. I mean, I've heard so many examples of a child who is sent on Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. A child is sent, and I'm going to make up names just for the, mommy says to the child, go down by Mr. Green, and I hope there's no Mr. Green out there who feels offended by the use of the name. It's a random name out of my head. My room is painted green. So go to Mr. Green and tell him mommy sent you for the thing, right? Mr. Green being the 70-something-year-old shopkeeper. And the child goes to Mr. Green, and this is 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and life is going on outside the shop. But when the child gets to the shop, Mr. Green looks up, looks down, looks across, closes the door for 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever. And then a few minutes later, he reopens the door. He looks up, he looks down, he looks across. And the child leaves and goes home with the thing, meaning the goods that mommy is trusting that week because she didn't get paid yet or something like that. Now, I will be bold enough to suggest that almost everybody who saw that child go into Mr. Green's shop and saw Mr. Green close up the shop knows that something untoward is about to happen. But how did mommy know to send the child to Mr. Green and that such a possibility existed? Because probably mommy was sent there to Mr. Green when she was a child, you know? And probably mommy's mommy was sent them because the Mr. Greens or the shopkeepers who do this sort of thing, they're well entrenched in these communities. They've been there for years. They're old people to some extent. And sometimes what happens is their children so Mr. Green might be in his 80s, but he has children in their 60s who doing the same thing now because daddy has always done it and gotten away with it. May have even done it to his own children who now feel that they're going to pass on that gift to others. So these things happen. So you cannot, and the average person will not look at Mr. Green, this quote unquote responsible, respectable old businessman who helping to keep the community together by trusting the goods to the families until they get paid. Most people will never suspect Mr. Green, but probably 50% of that village has been victims of this degree because they never stop at one, So we would rather, I would say, let's teach children to recognize tones of voice when the perpetrator goes into high excitement because they realize that an opportunity is at hand and they start to speak in a different way, not a different voice, not speaking in tongues, but with the in the throes of sexual excitement their voice might change. We have to tell the child when you hear he starts talking, so run, scream, bawl, scratch, do something, because he is now at a point where he's not going to be stopped by moral conscience, right? He's not going to be stopped if the child asks him nicely. We have to teach children that if you're in a group of children and this one person, man or woman, keeps trying to tell you, well, I have something for you. Let's go down the road a ways so I could give you this, or let's go upstairs. Don't go. Because if he really has something that he or she wants to give you, bring it in the group and give it in the presence of the other few children. So I said in an interview recently that while I don't want to sound alarmist, I think we need to teach our children to be suspicious to some extent. I got a little backlash over that because people felt, oh, you don't want children to trust their fathers and so on and so on. That's not what I was saying. What I was saying is a healthy sense of awareness of dangers around them is a good thing for children to have because the predators look like regular people. They are regular people, except some of them have twisted minds. So we have to teach children to be wary.
Those are very critical pointers, and I hope listeners you're taking note. Parents, guardians, you're taking note of those critical indicators that people who are regular folks, like trusted folks in society, they can be the perpetrators. And so if you're
Often are.
just, yes, if you're just joining with us, We're here on IPA Threshing Flow Helpline. We're getting ready to open up the lines to you in a bit. Of course, the numbers that you can call in. Of course, you can call the landline 231 1031. Okay, you can call the landline 231 1031, or you can call this other number 403 1031. So it's very easy, 103.1 to 1031 in that. And you can join in the discussion. You can have a question or comment to Mr. Tyrone. Of course, he's a rounded individual. Of course, he's very, very knowledgeable in the field where he, works to really help with victims of crimes like this, especially children. And Mr. Tyrone, we're going to kind of twist it a little bit because we don't want to talk about the perpetrators without dealing with the men, those. Let me just say, not just men, but we know we have a higher number of men being perpetrators than women.
Exactly.
But the
Yes.
perpetrators themselves, how is your work at the legal aid is facilitating, because what we do in the legal system, we just throw them in jail, or, we give them some menial punishment, and then they come back out, but they're not rehabilitated, they're not reformed, they go back to the societies, they carry out the same act, even worse, right? So how do we get to the men to change the mindset, to change the modus operandi, and help our societies change that kind of behavior?
Okay. Well, it's important to work with perpetrators, but one has to look at working with perpetrators from different entry points. Um, Very disturbingly, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of perpetrators who are themselves children, meaning young boys, young males under the age of 16, who are committing offenses on children 10, 11, 12, younger than that even. So at those ages, these young men definitely need rehabilitative assistance. They need help. They need psychosocial help where somebody does some sort of evaluation to understand where the behavior is coming from, what is driving it, and helping them to be able to make more conscious, to veer away from that behavior. So this psychosocial support is important for perpetrators. Even adults who are perpetrators sometimes need help and can be helped. But we have some long-term died in the world perpetrators who cannot be held beyond getting the full extent of the punishment that is available under the law. And if there is going to be backlash against me for making this statement, I stand by it. Because some people, they keep doing the same thing over and over again. And that might be because the law is lax. As I referred to earlier, sometimes the judges may hand down a sentence that is so small in comparison to the crime that they feel that they got away, and they serve the sentence and they come out and they do the same thing again. I would say that from the agency where I sit, where it is possible to work with the perpetrators of sexual violence to provide psychosocial or any other type of support, counseling, evaluations, and so on, we should do that. But we must try early in the interventions or interactions with perpetrators to understand what is their mindset behind it, right? There are certain programs we run where we do not accept sexual offenders as a group that we will work with, because we understand that for some sexual offenders, there's a certain kind of set of deeply rooted set of perceptions and behaviors that make them offenders. And so, even if they are to get some access to psychosocial support, they must first be made to feel the punishment for their crime so that they understand that there are consequences and that society will take that approach. We don't take this view when the offenders are very young, because we feel sometimes young people who offend, they are driven by a whole host of things, right? They are encouraged by probably peer pressure. They are exposed to negative influences through social media. The kinds of things they look at and listen to might influence them in a particular way. And the offense might be an experiment, not a pattern of behavior. So if it's an experiment, then you could pull them back. You could work with them and you could help them to understand that, these are these are offenses that are punishable by law, the impact it can have on their lives in the long term, the impact both social, emotional, psychosocial, and physical on their victims. So there are those that you can definitely work with, and we are available as Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic to offer the support that is required of us. Often the persons who come to us for support as offenders are referred by the court system, and so we would work with them to the extent possible. But we also are honest to know that there are times when we will not be able to work with an offender for any number of reasons. And we will inform the competent authority that we cannot do so, but here are other options for support. We believe that offenders need support where it is possible. As I said, we stand ready as an agency to provide the support that we can. But there are some people we would, when we look at the an evaluation of the the pattern of offense, the nature of their offense, the frequency of their offense, we may determine that they need a more involved level of psychosocial help that legal aid is not equipped to provide, you know? And then there are other interventions that they can be exposed to. Um, some people will look for psychiatric support, go to doctors. There are a number of practitioners who are available at a cost to work with persons on the private level. But again, Bishop, for people to get that kind of psychosocial help, they must come to a place where they acknowledge that they have a problem. And because we make so many excuses for perpetrators, a lot of them don't feel they have a problem. They blame the victim. Sometimes the parents, I have had cases where the mother of the perpetrator is blaming the child for being raped by her son. Oh, she wicked. She does walk in the village dressed like a big woman. She always flaunting herself, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, then there are others who echo this kind of nonsense that blame the victim and make it look like if the poor rapist, you know, all he did was do a little rape because the child attempted, So because we operate in that sort of double standard and hypocrisy, some of the same people who are the loudest voices for action against perpetrators should a member of their family be found out to be a perpetrator, they will fight tooth and nail to make sure that that person escapes any consequence, right? So we have to have an honest awareness of as society of this problem and the need to address it. And when persons are being held accountable, or the system is trying to hold people accountable for their actions, we need the public to come on board and say yes, whether he is the highest leader of a church, whether he's an inspector of police, whether he is the head of legal aid and counseling clinic, if he has committed this offense, the full extent of the law, the full force of the law must be brought to bear against him. And mothers have to stop making excuses for their sons, and wives have to stop making excuses for their husbands, and sisters have to stop making excuses for their brothers, because sometimes, because all these excuses are being made, etc., the perpetrators feel they didn't really do anything wrong and they don't need any help. So they're not open to a process of counseling or rehabilitation. And then the cycle will continue. So there's a lot of work for us to do, and a lot of it comes from public education.
Agreed. And what you're saying, it makes so much sense. But there's a kind of paradox that still goes on within that framework. Because on the one hand, we say, the perpetrator should get the full extent of the law, just lose them in jail somewhere, how we behave. But at the same time, when you're getting ready to help them, there's a system to help male, or there's a system to help perpetrators. People feel that that is unfair. Why are you helping these people? So
Yeah.
there's a kind of paradox that's going on here. How would they get help and yet be criticized for getting help?
Yeah. Yeah. And those are the kinds of interesting things that I think come from this hypocrisy, where, and on the one hand, we like to rant and rave when it's somebody we don't know, but when it's somebody we know, we want to take a different view. But we believe that help should be made available, and those who take advantage of it should get the full, those who are interested in it and accept it should get the full advantage of it. But our help must not, our willingness and desire to help must not blind us to the fact that these persons have committed offenses and they need to also be punished, because that's how you learn accountability. If you're held accountable for your action and you face the consequences of your action, you're likely to behave differently.
Great, great. And folks, remember, you can call in to the number to call is the landline number to call is 231-1031. You can call in and ask your questions at this point, and we will be happy to take your questions. And so, Mr. Tyrone, time is dwindling on us, and
I see,
you
yes.
know, we have been nourished for the last couple of minutes with so much good information. Of course, this is a discussion that cannot be exhausted. It's a
That's right.
discussion that will continue for perhaps as long as we live in the earth realm. But we want to talk about what you do in terms of getting help to male perpetrators. You have an initiative like the Spotlight Initiative, and of course you're making strides to go into the community, engage different institutions. So tell us more about that initiative.
Right. Well, the Spotlight Initiative is a project that is much bigger and well beyond the scope of legal aid. Legal aid and counseling. We're just one implementing agency. Briefly, as a background, Spotlight Initiative is a global initiative that was created jointly between the European Union and the United Nations system. It's funded by the European Union. 500 million euros have been provided as a multi-year, multi-country project that operates in about 70 countries around the world. Five of those countries are in the Caribbean region, and one country in the OECS, which is Grenada. And our project in Spotlight is really geared at working towards the reduction and hopefully eventual elimination of gender-based violence in its totality. And a big subset of gender-based violence is sexual violence and sexual offenses against women and girls. So agencies that are involved in the implementation of the project in Grenada, they include Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic, the Ministry of Social Development, GrenChap, a number of other organizations, both governmental and non-governmental. And the idea is that we will do a host of actions over the course of a few years that will raise public awareness about gender-based violence, that will do specific interventions, like in the case of legal aid, we have a program called Man to Man, which works with men who commit acts of violence, who commit or threaten to commit acts of violence against women. We're providing direct support to victims of gender-based violence in terms of looking for protection orders if they're victims of gender-based violence, including under that realm of sexual violence. They can go to the court with legal representation from our clinic to get a protection order and get other type of support. We provide mediation support. So on the Spotlight, Legal Aid is doing four different activities. One is doing a community rollout of the man-to-man program to ensure that more persons in the rural settings are able to take advantage of the program without going through the court process. On the other hand, we're working with young people in 10 communities to do a program called Foundations, which is a violence prevention program. Because while we have spent most of today speaking about sexual violence, we must admit that violence in its totality is a huge problem in Grenada. And you'll be surprised that there are 14-year-old boys in, I would say, quote unquote, relationships with 13-year-old girls who are hitting them, who are actually beating up on them because they feel that they're the man and they have a right so to do in the relationship. So we're doing this series of violence prevention sessions where we're just trying to get young people to understand violence is a choice. It is a negative choice. It has consequences, both in terms of the potential for legal interaction, prison time, and all of that, but also the impact on the person, the physical and other types of impact. So the Ministry of Social Development is doing quite a lot under the Spotlight Initiative as a state agency responsible for the project, but they're working closely with Legal Aid, Child Protection Authority, GrenChap, and other organizations to ensure that we're able to raise public awareness, look at the laws that need to be revised, updated, and so on. So we're proud to be a part of this project. It's global, but it's having a very direct local impact, and we want to continue on that. But it is a moment in time, right? Many of these projects come, they're there for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and then they move on. Hopefully, they would have helped us to create some new mechanisms and responses for dealing with some of these challenges. But there's a long term responsibility on the shoulders of the state to ensure that even if there's not an externally funded project, we continue to take actions as a country that address these problems and seek to provide protection for our women and girls and our boys and men as well. We know that a lot of men who commit sexual offenses may themselves have been victims of sexual offenses. And while it's not an excuse for doing it, sometimes it's an issue of kind of normalizing behavior. It happened to me, so I'm going to do it to somebody else. Sometimes it's as simple as that as a quote, as a starting point, and we have a responsibility to work with those victims, come perpetrators, to get them to understand that when if you can think of how hurt and damage you felt when somebody did it to you, then you must consider that your actions will have the same impact on somebody else. So don't pass on the hurt. You know what I mean? Find ways of doing things, doing different things, and use your pain and your hurt as a way of empowering you to teach, to help others to grow, rather than to inflict similar pain on hurt. So there are different entry points for working with perpetrators, but it comes from an understanding of where their behavior came from.
Right. So in other words, you're still keeping the perpetrators responsible while you're
Yes.
still helping them.
Yes, they must understand there are consequences for actions. Offenses against the law are punishable by the law, but we recognize that you may also be in need of help, right? So while we want you to be held accountable, we prefer if you don't do these things at all, we will try to help you, but you must understand that there are consequences. Because if people don't ever suffer consequences, they feel no sense of responsibility,
Good.
you know? Yeah.
You've said that so many times tonight. Yeah, because
Mhm.
we have to be held accountable for our behavior and for our actions. And
Yeah.
so, Mr. Tyrone, just please help us to understand as a church community, because as part of the resolve to bring hope to our nation as a church. We know, of course, the Spotlight Initiative is coming into the communities. And so, how is the church going to be part of that? How is the church engaged in that initiative? What can the church do? And I'm happy to know that there are some agencies out there that are actually doing something to alleviate this problem, because of course we may not be able to solve it, but we can certainly cushion a lot of the effects that's happening in our nation and our people, especially our women and girls, as you said, and in some instances our young boys.
Yeah. Well, the church has always been and continues to be a critical institution in the building of our society. If you look at the reality, Bishop, most of our children in their formative years, the first few years of life, spend more time in church than anywhere else. So the church and school, right? So this is where the greatest foundations come from. This is where a lot of our children will learn about trust. And unfortunately, part of the reality in terms of the church in Grenada, all churches, because when we say the church, we're speaking collectively, is that the church itself has been a place of harm for a lot of young people. A lot of young men were abused. A lot of young people, male and female, their first sexual action, their sexual orientation, their first pain in relation to sexual matters happened in the church, either if not in the church building, then in a church related function, you know. So the church has been a place of harm and hurt for a lot of people. But on the flip side, the church can be the place of greatest healing and hope for all our people. But the churches must understand that and must be proactive in providing information and education to young people about, as I talked about earlier, safe touch and those kind of things. And the church
Great.
must also be prepared to take these matters on frontally. I think you're getting a
Great.
call.
Do you have a caller on the line? We want to take the caller.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon. You're live. Caller, you there? We're just trying to access the caller.
Okay.
Hello, caller, you there? Good afternoon. We've lost the caller? Oh. Caller, you there? Good afternoon.
Yes, I'm hearing you now. Yes,
Yes.
I was kind of in and out of the program, so I'm not too sure if you spoke about this. But how does a victim of sexual abuse go about reporting a matter, something that happened to them? What are the steps that you would say? Do they go straight to legal aid? Do they tell a teacher, a friend? I'm not too sure. What do you suggest is the best thing to do if they realize that they've been sexually abused, like a child or even an adult? What do you suggest should happen?
Okay. Well, there are a number of mechanisms for reporting. So let's say it's a child who is actively going to school. Teachers and principals are known as what we call duty bearers, right? They're at the front lines. So if a child feels confidence enough and is trusting enough of a teacher or principal or guidance counselor, the child can report, can disclose to that person, whether it's the child self-disclosing that something has happened to him or her, or just reporting that they suspect something is happening to another child. Immediately, the principal or the authority figure gets this information. They have a legal responsibility to provide that, to report that on the child's behalf. That report can be made to the Child Protection Authority. The Child Protection Authority will then take action by reporting or informing the police, and an investigation will begin jointly by the two agencies. A person can choose to come directly to legal aid and counseling clinic, but once the report comes to us, we will inform the person giving us the information that our immediate next step is to report it to the Child Protection Authority. So pastors and preachers are also considered duty bearers. Nurses and doctors are duty bearers. Counselors are duty bearers. And these are all persons who, by virtue of what they do professionally, may come into information because somebody might entrust the information to them, or might suspect based on certain things that they're observing in relation to a child's behavior, etc., that they may have reason to suspect that something is going on with that child or being onto what is happening with that child, and they have a responsibility to report. So, as I said, you can come directly to legal aid, but they, the procedure really speaks to report to a duty bearer who then reports to the Child Protection Authority. You can call the Child Protection Authority directly. You can call the Special Victims Unit of the Royal Grenada Police Force directly. You can report to any police station on the island directly, and they will pass the information on. So we've tried to put a reporting protocol in place, reporting procedures in place. In fact, there's a booklet that speaks to those procedures. The bottom line is any point that receives the report, receives the information, if it's not the Child Protection Authority, must immediately pass it on to the Child Protection Authority and or the Royal Grenada Police Force, so that an investigation can begin. And this all has to happen in strict confidence. If you as an adult in a community suspect that there's an incident or incidences of sexual abuse happening against anybody, especially a child though, you can call and give a report. You will not necessarily be required to give your personal information, but well, we may ask for it. You're not obligated to give it, but in order to be able to follow up and so on, that information may be requested. But people can also have the confidence that they can report without giving their private information. Once the information that they disclose in terms of the suspicion is clear enough that the competent authority can act on that information. And we really want to encourage people to report. People sometimes say, I know it happened, but it's not my business. I don't want to get involved. Please, I'm begging you, get involved. Your involvement may save a life. It may save a whole family of children. It may save a village of children. Get involved. Run the risk that the report you make may be wrong, but at least somebody would check than to decide it may not be right. So you're not going to say anything and then the abuse is happening unabated throughout the village or the whole.
Great, great. That was great information, and I hope that we're taking note of how we ought to report cases like this and who are those that are obligated to report. Very, very important information. Callers, you have just a window of time to call in if you have a question because we are winding down this very important discussion this evening. Of course, Mr. Tyrone, we have to have you back some other time, to continue more of this discussion because, what you've been sharing with us for the last hour really is very important information that the public needs to know, the body of Christ needs to know. And so, we want to be able to give these important information to our people to empower them and to alleviate the anxieties that people are facing relative to how we deal with situations like this. And those of you who are just joining us, maybe you just reached home from work, we're here live in studio, Hope 103.1 FM, and we're the International Pentecostal Assembly Threshing Floor Helpline. Of course, we want to big up all of our 5 churches on the island here in the Spice Country. And so we want to be able to share these great information with you, the general viewing audience here on this platform. And of course, we've been chatting with Mr. Tyrone Buckmeyer. And so he is a representative of the Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic, also with emphasis on the Spotlight Initiative as well. And we have been talking here for the last hour on sexual offenses and sexual crime. And Mr. Buckmeyer, we know that we are dwindling with time. Of course, if you want to call, you can still call and post your question. We will entertain your call just so that Mr. Tyrone can answer those pertinent questions that must be asked out there. And I know you have a lot of questions, but Mr. Tyrone, we want to kind of wind down because it's already 7 p.m. And so, you just wanted to give us some general tips and ideas as we close up, as in terms of what we've been talking about for this discussion. And perhaps you can give us just your closing comments, or somebody has a question. The person is asking,
It's on a chat, yes.
yeah, do you see the question?
Yes, it's about asking about protecting the identity of people who may try to get help for a child who is
Right.
being sexually abused but don't want to get involved in conflict with the family. So as I mentioned in response to the caller, you can give the information without disclosing your personal information. You can remain anonymous, but give the information about the incidents that you think is happening, because often this is one of the positions people take, that they prefer not to get in conflict, especially if you live in the neighborhood. And it's likely that the family may think it's you, and sometimes they come and cuss you or they start throwing words at your family and so on. So you can give the information. If you came into our agency or you called in, you give the information in strictest confidence. And I'm sure all the other responding agencies, Child Protection Authority, Special Victims Units, or the police force, will respect your right to privacy if you decide not to disclose your personal information. What we would ask, though, is that the information, if you don't want us to be able to contact you, so you're not giving us your name and number, we'd ask you to give as many specifics as you can about the situation you suspect, so that they'll be able to follow up without having to get back in touch with you. All right. But one way to ensure that the information can be followed up on is also to probably go via the school, because principals and teachers and so on will have to disclose their information if they're reporting in an official capacity. Bishop, I realize so often once we begin this conversation and the sharing of information, time goes so very quickly. So I'm going to be bold and invite you to invite me back. Right? I will say that I would be happy to continue this conversation at some point, to look at this element again, but also to go further to talk more about the role of the church. I think there's a lot churches can do, and we haven't had enough time to go into this information. I see on the chat came up quickly,
Share
what
the
is the
numbers,
number?
yes, that we
So I'll
can
give you a few numbers very quickly, if you'll allow me. The Legal Aid and Counseling Clinic is 440-3785 or 3788. The Child Protection Authority is 435-0293. That will get you to the head office in St. George's, but they have sub offices that can give you information as well. Then you have the Royal Grenada Police Force. You can call any of the stations. So there are different stations in different parishes. You can call for the Community Relations Department, or any police station wants us to report, they can direct you. There is a special victims unit that was set up within the Royal Grenada Police Force that deals specifically with gender-based violence and sexual violence related matters. I don't have the direct number for them in my head, but if you call the Royal Grenada Police Force, any station, and ask for the number to get through to the special victims unit, you'll get that information. So those are some of the key agencies as frontline responding agencies. So please reach out. Take your role as a defender of our nation's women and children seriously, whether you're male or female. And I urge you not just to not be a perpetrator and not to harbor and facilitate perpetrators, but also to just spread information so that people know what can happen, what needs to happen. If we have the opportunity to continue this conversation, Bishop, at some point in the near future, I would really like us to spend some time looking at the many, many ways that churches can be involved in this fight. So as I said, I have invited you to invite me back, so the ball is now in your court. I'll be happy to discuss with you at some point if that's a possibility and when we can make that happen.
Yes, certainly. And of course, we are going to take you up on that offer and invite you here again, perhaps in the next discussion that we're having. Of course, we're here every other Thursday bringing you this good stuff, and we really appreciate Mr. Tyrone Buckmeyer. Of course, a wealth of information is stored up in that resource of an individual. And we're so very happy to have him tonight. I know he had some challenges today, but he still made the time available to us to give us this information that is very important and critical here as we wrap up this very important threshing floor helpline this evening. Of course, International Pentecostal Assembly, folks, if you missed it because you got home late or you didn't have time to view because you were in some other engagement, you can visit our Facebook page, International Pentecostal Assembly Grenada, and there it's going to be for you available that you can listen again and again and take in all the good information. You have the numbers that are available. If you have a situation to call, of course, Mr. Tyrone and the Legal Aid Counseling Clinic is always open and available to persons with its situations like that. So don't be afraid to call. And so we want to thank you so much for being a part of this session, Mr. Tyrone. Again, we cannot overemphasize the fact that we are so grateful to have you here. And of course, you're going to come back because this discussion is a national discussion. Really, we've had a wave of activity around that in recent times. So we need to really provide some kind of hope and some kind of information that will help our people cope with that. And so we want to thank all of you for viewing. We know that Mr. Tan, you know, you make history tonight. You're the very first guest that we have as we
Okay,
revamp
thank you.
this Stretching Flow Helpline. We started in
Okay.
COVID. Now we on air, and you're the very first host for IPA Threshing Flow Helpline. So, you know, that's a little bit of history there, but we're going to have you back. Thank
Thank
you
you.
all for viewing this evening. Or International Pentecostal Assembly Threshing Flow Helpline. I am Bishop Esther R. Baptiste, and so we signing off for this evening. We want you to have a pleasant evening and the rest of the week, and we'll see you again next time on our Threshing Flow Helpline every other Thursday. So that we're not going to be on this Thursday coming, but the next Thursday. And of course, we hope to have Mr. Tyrone again with us, sharing some good information on Hope 105, 103.1 FM. So long. Bye bye.
Good night.